Welcome, I'm Rose Aguilar, and this is Your Call's special series, The Authoritarian Playbook. Today we are discussing the Republican Party's free speech crackdown after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the far-right founder of Turning Point USA, who was very close with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. Trump and his allies immediately responded to Kirk's murder by blaming the, quote, far left and left-wing extremism without knowing who carried out the shooting or what the motivation was. Here is Trump speaking from the Oval Office shortly after the shooting.
For years, those on the radical left have compared wonderful Americans like Charlie to Nazis and the world's worst mass murderers and criminals. This kind of rhetoric is directly responsible for the terrorism that we're seeing in our country today, and it must stop right now. My administration will find each and every one of those who contributed to this atrocity and to other political violence, including the organizations that fund it and support it, as well as those who go after our judges, law enforcement officials, and everyone else who brings order to our country. From the attack on my life in Butler, Pennsylvania last year, which killed a husband and father, to the attacks on ICE agents, to the vicious murder of a healthcare executive in the streets of New York, to the shooting of House Majority Leader Steve Scalise and 3 others, radical left political violence has hurt too many innocent people and taken too many lives.
Trump says many groups are already under investigation, and he has vowed to fire anyone speaking callously about Charlie Kirk's death. Here is J.D. Vance hosting the Charlie Kirk podcast on Monday from the White House.
So when you see someone celebrating Charlie's murder, call them out. And hell, call their employer. We don't believe in political violence, but we do believe in civility. And there is no civility in the celebration of political assassination. Get involved. Get involved. Get involved. It's the best way to honor Charlie's legacy. Start a chapter of TPUSA or get involved in the one that already exists. If you're older, volunteer for your local party, write an op-ed in your local paper, run for office. I can't promise you this is going to be easy. I can't promise you that all of us will avoid Charlie's fate. I can't promise you that I will avoid Charlie's fate. But the best way to honor him is to shine the light of truth like a torch in the very darkest places. Go do it.
That was J.D. Vance hosting the Charlie Kirk podcast from the White House on Monday. The alleged gunman, Tyler Robinson, is just 22. According to reports, he was raised in a Republican home. Social media photos posted by his family show him and his 2 younger brothers shooting and posing with guns. Authorities are still searching for a motive, and yet the administration continues to blame the left and what they're calling terrorist networks. Here is Stephen Miller, White House Deputy Chief of Staff, speaking with J.D. Vance on the Charlie Kirk podcast on Monday.
We are going to channel all of the anger that we have over the organized campaign that led to this assassination to uproot and dismantle these terrorist networks. So let me explain a little bit what that means. So,
I've got 30 seconds, so be quick, Stephen.
The organized doxing campaigns, the organized riots, the organized street violence, the organized campaigns of dehumanization, vilification, posting people's addresses, combining that with messaging that's designed to trigger and incite violence, and the actual organized cells that carry out and facilitate the violence, it is a vast domestic terror movement. And with God as my witness, we are going to use every resource we have at the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and throughout this government to identify, disrupt, dismantle, and destroy these networks and make America safe again for the American people. It will happen, and we will do it in Charlie's name.
That was Stephen Miller. So what has happened since Kirk's assassination? University faculty and teachers across the country have either been fired or placed on leave. There have been over 180 complaints filed against teachers in Texas. The Pentagon is cracking down on soldiers' media posts. Marco Rubio says the State Department has denied visas to people celebrating Kirk's murder. The Washington Post fired Karen Attiah, its only black columnist. for her posts on Blue Sky. Axios reports that private companies have fired employees for Kirk posts on social media. They include Freddy's Frozen Custard and Steak Burgers, the Carolina Panthers, and Washington, D.C. law firm Perkins Coie. American Airlines, United Airlines, and Delta Airlines have all disciplined employees over Kirk-related posts, multiple outlets reported. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy endorsed American Airlines' decision to remove employees. So what are your thoughts about what we are seeing and people who are losing their jobs or being disciplined? What are your thoughts about how the right is responding to the assassination of Charlie Kirk? You can give us a call at 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. Today we're joined by two guests. Khalil Gibran Muhammad is professor of African American Studies at Public Affairs at Princeton University, board chair of the Vera Institute of Justice, and author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. Hi, Khalil. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Rose, for having me.
Great to have you. We're also joined by Alberto Toscana, adjunct professor at the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University, columnist for In These Times, and author of Late Fascism, Race, Capitalism, and the Politics of Crisis. Hi, Alberto. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on your show, Rose.
Well, Alberto, given that you are in Canada, I wonder if you can give us an outside perspective, our neighbor to the north. What do you think of what is happening right now around the assassination of Charlie Kirk, especially all of the people who are losing their jobs or being disciplined?
I think what's quite remarkable and was very evident in the J.D. Vance hosted Charlie Kirk show from the White House itself. So the fusion now of the MAGA movement and the state seems to be extremely advanced. But one of the things that was very striking, also viewing this from the outside, was how systematic this idea of linking the nonprofit sector and NGOs, so not just universities, not just businesses and the people working in them, but focusing in particular, right, on the NGO and nonprofit sector presented as, in J.D. Vance's words, what was fomenting, facilitating, and even engaging in violence. In particular, Vance singled out, in a way that I thought was particularly ominous, an article in The Nation, and then proceeded, right, to identify the Open Society Foundation, or the Soros Foundation, and the Ford Foundation as making up what he called the pyramid of a broader left-wing network whose apex or whose culmination was the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Now, I thought both the place where this was being voiced, that is to say from the White House itself, and the ways in which the targets were being identified, the targets of Vance's rhetoric, was particularly ominous and seemed to be a kind of crossing of a threshold. I also, and maybe I'll conclude this comment on that, I also found it particularly striking to have the Soros Foundation referred to as, you know, a radical left component of some kind of terror network. A little bit of a personal anecdote, but, you know, over a decade ago, I was invited to give a talk on Marxism at a event, I think a summer school organized in Macedonia by the Soros Foundation. And I had my talk canceled because it was about Marxism. So the idea, I think, that the Soros Foundation is some kind of far left grouping is very baffling.
Wow. And did they give you a reason?
No, but next year I had the same abstract and replaced the word Marxism with democracy, and then it was fine.
Well, that is Alberto Toscano, an adjunct professor at the School of Communications at Simon Fraser University in Canada, providing an outside perspective on what is happening. after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Khalil, what's your initial response to what we're hearing from the Trump administration and these firings and disciplinary action really taken across the board from airlines to schools?
Well, I see this as an escalation of the Trump administration's agenda, as it says, to root out and destroy the radical left in this country. As part of higher education, as Alberto is as well, the university and college landscape has been under assault by the authoritarian agenda of this administration. And if we look at the attacks on international students in general and pro-Palestinian demonstrators in particular, through the deployment of ICE agents to round up people, to disappear them, to incarcerate them, to deport them, the ascription of terrorism to them was just the opening chapter of what looks like at least a 4-year story that we are all going to be part of with this administration. I think it's connected that the military assassinated alleged Venezuelan gang members of breaking international law. I think that if we link the terrorism charge of international and domestic students on college campuses to the escalation of killing suspected gang members in international waters, to now the ridiculously absurd and yet totally normalized language of associating people who are critical of this administration or who exercise their First Amendment rights to speak on policy issues, just like Charlie Kirk did, as part of terrorist cells, which is the language that Stephen Miller used in his interview with J.D. Vance. I want to borrow here what Jeff Sharlet, the journalist who has covered the far right for 20 years, called in his best-selling book, The Undertow. We are in a slow-moving civil war. I don't know what other language to use with respect to this administration's plans for what comes next.
Khalil, how would you put all of this in historical context?
Well, I think it's kind of hard to find the perfect analogy. So there are two that I think come immediately to mind. One is perhaps more obvious, which is that under Woodrow Wilson's administration, we saw the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. It was anti-Catholic, it was anti-immigrant, xenophobic, nativist, racist, anti-Mexican. It had a very unifying vision of saving America then, at a moment when intellectuals like Madison Grant, who was a New York intellectual who wrote about a version of great replacement theory. It was the height of the eugenics movement. And so we saw wide-scale political violence committed by the right. We saw wide-scale racial terrorism committed by vigilantes and organized militia and violence like the Ku Klux Klan. We saw a sympathetic president in Woodrow Wilson who essentially co-signed on this violence. The euphemism, making America great, first appears in this moment, America for Americans, or 100% Americanism. I think that is a useful historical context for understanding, and it was more or less 100 years ago. I think the second example is a little bit more obscure, but I think it's worth mulling over, which is to say that the Confederate States of America came to attack this country in the attack on Fort Sumter in 1860 after a series of secession resolutions. And of course, that led to the Civil War. I think what is interesting in this moment is if in the 1860 election, Abraham Lincoln had lost and the pro-slavery side had won, and thus the Confederates had been in charge of the American military at that time, what would have been the future of this country in that regard? Would the good guys have won the Civil War? Would there have ever been a Reconstruction? I think is worth considering. That, in a sense, the analogy being that Donald Trump is now in charge of the full levers and power of the federal government in ways that certainly Woodrow Wilson had at his disposal. But if we are moving into a time of organized political violence that can lead to a civil war, the Confederate or neo-Confederate side is now in charge.
And what would you add, Alberto? How would you put this in historical context?
Well, I think what I was struck by were some of the references in the commentary on the assassination, suggesting that perhaps the United States was entering into a period reminiscent of 1970s terrorism and armed violence in Europe. The so-called years of lead in my own country of Italy, for instance, were referred to in a number of articles. And while I think the characterization of a slow-moving civil war is suggestive, and whilst there is a lot of organized movements, very well-armed militias with ideologies oriented towards civil war in the United States, I find it particularly striking that the administration is reviving this language, also from the 70s, actually, of the terror network, and suggesting that there is an orientation towards organized armed political violence on the left in the United States. Now, this seems to me to be just empirically false. The language of political violence that has been advanced kind of sits very oddly, or indeed straightforwardly contradicts what are the actual statistics about politically motivated violence in the United States over the recent period. Now, I want to just mention two studies that come from organizations that one could not in any way suspect of left-wing sympathies, namely the Cato Institute, the libertarian right-wing organization founded by Murray Rothbard and Charles Koch, and the Anti-Defamation League, which of course has played a very prominent role in the Trump administration's campaign to demonize, persecute, and repress Palestine and anti-genocide activism. Now, the Cato Institute, and this was just a few days ago, noted that, first of all, between 2020 and 2025, only 0.07% of murders in the United States could be ascribed a political motive, that is 7 in 10,000. And that according to their numbers, between 1975 and 2025, excluding 9/11, politically related murders, which again are this tiny proportion of the overall character of massive social violence in the United States, 10% could be ascribed to so-called left-wing causes and 63% to so-called right-wing causes. Yeah. The Anti-Defamation League also has a study. It's notable that none of the mass shooting and mass killing events that had political motives over the last 30 years or so could be ascribed to left-wing causes. In 2021, 91%, and this is again, according to the ADL, by no means part of a progressive NGO network, 91% of murders with political motives in 2021 could be ascribed to the far right, 6% to the left. And over the period of 2012 to 2021, only 4% of politically motivated murders could be ascribed to the left. Now, in that same podcast that you mentioned, the Charlie Kirk show broadcast from the White House, Vance said it was a statistical fact that the left was committing the majority of political violence. And we can see again in data provided by two, I think, in different ways, rather right-wing organizations, that this is very much not the case. Indeed, you could say it's a complete inversion of just, empirical truths. And I think that's very significant because we can see how much this imaginary, fabricated threat is being used to wreak massive repression across all of these institutions, civil service, legal organizations, universities, nonprofits, and is being used as a pretext to dismantle any capacities for self-organization by opponents of an administration and indeed a president who has historically low approval ratings, right? And so I think there is also a very deliberate effort to accelerate this dismantling and destroying of the civil society institutions and groups that have any resolute opposition to the government and to the administration, because of ultimately how weak they are in terms of consensus and support. Indeed, even bits of their own MAGA supporters are cleaving away from them on questions like the Epstein files, like support for Israel at all costs. And I think that's also a significant factor.
We have a couple of emails about violence, and people wanted us to bring out some facts, which you just did. One more that's really important. Joseph Gedeon in The Guardian has a piece today writing, the U.S. Justice Department has scrubbed a study from its website, concluding that far-right extremists have killed far more Americans than any other domestic terrorist group. The Vanish study opened with, since 1990, far-right extremists have committed far more ideologically motivated homicides than far-left or radical Islamist extremists, including 227 events that took more than 520 lives. In the same period, far-left extremists committed 42 ideologically motivated attacks that took 78 lives. So again, the DOJ has scrubbed this study from its website. Before we go to break, can we talk about the self-censorship that people are engaging in because of this, the real fear that people are feeling because of this? Khalil, you're a professor of African American Studies at Public Affairs at Princeton University. We invited a fairly prominent professor to join us today, and they said, I'm laying low. I'm getting death threats. My family's getting death threats. I am not doing media interviews right now. So people are self-censoring. They're not doing interviews. They're afraid.
Well, they have every reason to be. I mean, listen, I think a lot of people who have a public platform, either because of social media or because they appear in person. I just did a talk with Michael Roth, the president of Wesleyan yesterday, Wesleyan University, on Monday evening at the New York Historical Society in a public venue. And as someone who's never been a big fan of the, militarization of public spaces, I was grateful there were metal detectors there before I walked into the building. Because retaliatory violence, as people understand it, and has been articulated by the highest reaches of this government, and even the clip you played of J.D. Vance basically saying, let's go, it's go time, as some others have described, like Steve Bannon saying the war is here. Who knows, who will be next, and for whatever lunatic reason. So I don't blame that person for saying they're laying low. I gave some thought to this personally. I do think that, listen, political violence has been a key feature of the United States for 100 years. At the end of slavery, Black people experienced racial terror in all its forms. Mexicans, descended people did as well, Chinese immigrants. I mean, political violence has been an instrument of social control in this country. It's just a fact. And we spent a lot of time talking about statistics about the current period, but if you look at it in total, it is a story of right-wing violence directed towards populations deemed to be unworthy of their full humanity. So yes, self-censorship is real, fear is real, and it will only intensify in the days and weeks to come.
What is it like for you, Alberto, from your vantage point in Canada, to see that your colleagues are afraid to speak out because this country is so heavily armed?
Well, I mean, I think it gives one pause. I think it it suggests how much the administration and the state in this, multi-level way that goes from interfering in curricula to directly pushing the firing of administration to now engaging in these, open threats to political speech, organizing nonprofits, and so on, has contributed, right? And very deliberately contributed to creating an environment where people are indeed afraid. That said, I think this was definitely evident over the question of Palestine. There's a lot of self-censorship that I don't think is generated by genuine fears about one's, physical safety, but there's a lot of self-censorship that is based on the fear of, losing certain privileges, of not having access to certain social networks, and so on and so forth, right? So I think a lot of the ways in which, many centrist or, liberal figures and many, institutional administrators have, fully contributed to and fully colluded, I think, with this agenda across numerous universities, including Columbia and, Harvard to some extent and others. I think that is also a very significant issue. So I do think, I take very seriously in a country that has such levels of gun ownership, but also such levels of just use of firearms, that people will be more careful or cowed. But I also think we shouldn't forget how much self-censorship is taking place just because of what my friend Rod Ferguson calls the social reproduction of cowardice, right? There is also that, and I don't think we should underestimate it.
We're going to take a quick break. Today on Your Call, it's our Authoritarian Playbook series. We're talking about the free speech crackdown after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. You can join us at 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. University faculty and teachers across the country have either been fired or placed on leave for their posts about Charlie Kirk. There have been over 180 complaints filed against teachers in Texas. The Pentagon is cracking down on soldiers' media posts. The Washington Post fired Karen Attiah for her posts on Blue Sky. Karen Attiah was the Post's only Black columnist. Axios reports that private companies have fired employees, including the Carolina Panthers, the Washington, D.C. law firm Perkins Coie. American Airlines, United Airlines, and Delta have disciplined employees on Charlie Kirk-related posts. So there's a lot going on across the country. If you've seen this in your community, we'd love to hear from you. What are your overall thoughts about what we are seeing? 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. Alberto Toscano is adjunct professor at the School of Communications at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia, columnist for In These Times, and author of Late Fascism, Race, Capitalism, and the Politics of Crisis. Khalil Gibran Muhammad is professor of African American Studies and Public Affairs at Princeton University, board chair of the Vera Institute of Justice, and author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. This is Your Call. We'll be back after this. This is Your Call. I'm Rose Aguilar. Today, it's our Authoritarian Playbook. Every week, we will talk about the latest news, put it in historical context, and find out how people are responding. Today, we are talking about the GOP free speech crackdown after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Today, we're joined by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, professor of African American Studies and Public Affairs at Princeton University, and Alberto Toscano, adjunct professor at the School of Communications assassination at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia. I want to play 2 more clips, and then we'll read a few emails and get responses from today's guests. So first, this is Republican Representative Nancy Mace speaking to reporters on the day Charlie Kirk was shot.
I'm going to say this. Democrats own what happened today. I am devastated. My kids have called panicking. All the kids of every conservative in the country called panicking. Just because you speak your mind on an issue doesn't mean you get shot.
By that logic, do Republicans own the shooting of the 2 Democratic lawmakers in Minnesota? Isn't this on both sides?
Are you kidding me?
No, I'm asking.
We don't know what condition Charlie Kirk is in right now. Some raging leftist lunatic put a bullet through his neck, and you want to talk about Republicans right now? No.
No, I'm asking
not at all.
You said the Democrats have owned it too, but I'm asking.
Democrats own this.
But isn't there a problem with political violence across the spectrum?
Yeah, we're talking about Charlie Kirk right now. That's the subject of this that we're talking about right now. Democrats own this 100%.
That is Republican Representative Nancy Mace speaking to reporters on the day he was shot. This was before the shooter was apprehended. Here is Donald Trump's Attorney General Pam Bondi speaking on Katie Miller's podcast, the wife of Stephen Miller. You will hear from Katie Miller first.
Do you see more law enforcement going after these groups who are using hate speech and putting cuffs on people so we show them that some action is better than no action?
We will absolutely target you, go after you if you are targeting anyone with hate speech.
So that was Attorney General Pam Bondi. What are your thoughts about the response to all of this? This is not getting much attention, but on the Charlie Kirk podcast that J.D. Vance hosted, RFK Jr. said that Charlie Kirk would not be supporting the censorship that we are seeing. And then Matt Walsh blog on Twitter, he calls himself a theocratic fascist. He writes, in response to what Pam Bondi said, is get rid of her today. This is insane. Conservatives have fought for decades for the right to refuse service to anyone. We won that fight. Now Pam Bondi wants to roll it back for no reason. What are your thoughts on the response, Khalil? What strikes you about this?
Well, I mean, listen, the broad frame of this conversation is fascism and authoritarianism. So on one hand, there are no rules for Nancy Mace and seemingly many members of the Trump administration, including the current attorney general. Facts don't matter. Rule of law doesn't matter. The Constitution is only relevant when it's useful to them, and otherwise it can be discarded. So I'm trying not to be dismissive of the importance of this because I think it's dangerous, but I'm not surprised by Nancy Mace. I'm more surprised at the extent to which any other members of the Republican Party that have served in that chamber prior to the emergence of MAGA would not categorically say that it is not acceptable to ascribe motivations to an entire Democratic Party and people who vote for the Democratic ticket as part of a left-wing terrorist cell or organized violence movement. I mean, it's just, so that to me is really the headline that we ought to be discussing here to try to understand their motivations for accepting these terms. And I appreciate you giving us a sound for 2 people who identify as conservatives who are saying this is absurd, because it absolutely is. And there's been some reporting in the Times and elsewhere to point out for people who identify as conservatives that this notion of going after the NGO sector and associating them as part of a left-wing terrorist mob, one is inappropriate. And 2, at best, you would open an investigation with due process into their tax exempt status based on the violations of statutory law. So that is what I think about the absurdity of it. But I also recognize that with this administration and with MAGA movement in general, a fascist movement does not play by the rules, and it has no intentions of doing so.
Alberto, what would you add?
Yeah, following on Khalil's point, I think it's the fusion and the very explicit fusion of the MAGA movement and the enormous repressive capacities of the U.S. state, juridical, political, communication, and otherwise, which is really coming to the fore in this moment. That is to say that, what transpired, especially from Vance's statements on that Charlie Kirk podcast from the White House, but also very much from Stephen Miller, who I think is the spearhead of this further authoritarian acceleration, is the sense that the U.S. state and its various repressive arms is going to be turned to the task of retribution against those who have, so to speak, martyred one of their own. I mean, it's not just a matter of, using this as a general occasion or excuse for, increasing militarization, securitization, et cetera. I think it's explicitly political, which is why the clip of Mace, responding with indignation at the reference to the political murders of Melissa Hortman and others was so telling, right? Because those deaths don't matter to them at all. Because what's at stake now is directly expressing the MAGA project, and therefore also this, a slow or perhaps not so slow moving vision of civil war directly at the level of the state. And, we've seen this too in the explicit politicization of ICE agents who make, direct political statements to camera whilst they're, abducting people off the streets of DC and elsewhere. You see this in the pronouncements of Tom Homan against the mayor of Chicago. I think this is a really significant aspect and symptom of this authoritarian acceleration when the MAGA movement and the state and the administration become, increasingly difficult to tell apart. And that's why I think it was a very deliberate idea to do this, Charlie Kirk show from the White House, or indeed to fly his casket in Air Force Two and the like.
Right. And the flags were at half-mast. Over the weekend, we saw sports teams taking part in a moment of silence for Charlie Kirk. We have an email from Philip who says the government's campaign to ask citizens to snitch on their fellow citizens to their employers is shocking. That's a tactic that we associate with the repression of the Soviets. It takes bread out of the mouths of the accused and their families and is best characterized as vicious. We saw the harmful effects of blacklisting in the 1950s. Is that the America that decent people would want to repeat? Well, thank you for that email, Philip. Let's hear from a few callers. Let's go to Parker in San Francisco. Hi, Parker. Thank you for holding.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you both to your guests. I think your guests just talked about kind of the points in the question that I want to get at very well. They talked about this kind of being a fascist regime where the rules don't really matter, and also the explicit tying of, violence to politics and the way that they are choosing to respond to this assassination attempt. And I think my question really is, it feels like the Democratic Party is so adherent to rule following, and often it feels at this point politically to their detriment. And what I guess I'm trying to understand is I don't really know how to react to or to meaningfully criticize a point of view that doesn't play by the rules, that mostly focuses on its own fascist agenda, and also is very openly and willing to embrace political violence when it suits their needs, when it impacts people that matters for them. Because as your guest pointed out, for other deaths, for other political parties, it just simply doesn't matter to them. I know Trump actually said he didn't even remember who the Democratic representatives were in Minnesota who were assassinated just recently in his office, which feels very deliberate in terms of trying to point out how little those violent acts of violence matter. So my question would be, what is there kind of a political option to move against for government that's choosing that? So thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Parker. Khalil, do you want to take that first?
Sure. Well, I think the caller is right to at least ask the question, what capacity does the Democratic Party have, and is it using it? So the answer is that it certainly has the bully pulpit of its own voice, its speech, its capacity to organize locally. I mean, we often think of the town square in relationship to protest activity, demonstrations, and rallies, which are certainly important vehicles, just as we've seen on the right. The MAGA movement is an advancement of the Tea Party, and the Tea Party was born out of gathering in opposition to Obama's candidacy and what it perceived to be the eventual socialist hijacking of America. So here we are. Now, that being said, we have not really seen Democrats take to their constituents, take to the communities where their voters live, and educate those voters, be they their own constituents or the broader community of which they represent, to insist upon not only the rules of this society, but what facts are relevant, and to paint a vision of how we get out of this mess. We are not learning anything from the vast majority of Democratic leaders in this country about what to make of what moment we're living in. They themselves appear generally to be either fearful of electoral consequences, of poking the bear of the right, or fearful for their own safety. I'm not sure. What I can say is that one ray of hope and of mixed outcomes is the candidacy of Zoran Mamdani, who is running for mayor of New York, who was popularly elected by the rules of the election that took place for the primary. And Democratic leaders like Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, have still not supported them. This is low-hanging fruit for at least galvanizing around a version of a response to right-wing populism by supporting someone who was rightfully elected by the rules that Democrats are very keen to follow. That makes no sense. And one is only to speculate that between the two of them, they are either fearful of alienating Israeli supporters, or they are fearful of their own electoral future if they're perceived to be supporting a Democratic socialist who, by the way, was rightfully elected to represent economically populist issues, which has to do with free bus rides and not destroying capitalism.
What are your thoughts, Alberto?
Well, I think we might be too quick to depict the increasingly authoritarian GOP and MAGA as simply rule-breaking or presenting the idea that rules don't matter. I think one of the things that's been very striking, and this is especially the case if we look at their weaponization of immigration law, is that, the United States legal system, the history of the law in the United States is replete with authoritarianism based very often on racial discrimination and domination, as well as on the repression of political opponents, anarchists, socialists, people engaging in Palestinian solidarity and the like. So, there is an immense amount of authoritarian potential, especially having to do with the outsized powers of the U.S. presidency compared to so many other constitutions that the Republicans, and especially the Republicans under Trump, use in a very concerted and systematic and deliberate way. Which, of course, is also one of the big asymmetries with the Democrats, who have often been much more wary of engaging in that kind of, lawfare or use, kind of militant use of the law. We can see this, for instance, very much in terms of Supreme Court nominations, the Merrick Garland case, and so on. So I think we should we should keep in mind that, in fact, actually existing authoritarianisms and indeed fascism didn't just abandon the law. They had just different uses of it to increase repression and domination. And I think that's a very significant thing to keep in mind.
Well, thank you again for the call. Let's go to Amy in San Francisco. Hi, Amy. Welcome to the show.
Hey there, Rose. Love your show. I want to just encourage everyone, and I say this as someone whose family roots go back to the civil rights and anti-war movements, and I have family members who put their livelihoods and their lives in some cases on the line for that. But it is so important for us not to give into fear. There's so much that people can be afraid of right now, but when we're in a state of constant fear, it's so easy for us to do things we would never do normally, for us to act in ways that can be easily influenced by forces we wouldn't normally be influenced by. In that vein, I just want to add a correction and a few notes of hope. Pam Bondi's statement about hate speech, she was immediately and ferociously attacked from all sides of the right and had to back down from that. So the whole idea that they're going after hate speech, people were calling for her to be fired from everywhere in their coalition. So I think that at least is one victory for free speech, and that's something Charlie Kirk himself, whatever you think of his opinions, he was a true advocate of free speech, and he would have supported that. I also just want to say how easy it is in this very riled up time to I just want to encourage everyone to really look for themselves at what's happening. Listen to Charlie Kirk yourself. I am, like I said, deeply, deeply on the left, but I pay attention to what goes on the right. And I don't recognize the person that's being portrayed when I hear these poll clips. And if you will, I just want to end with one thing from the New York Times. This is a quote. "The world he saw was distorted and dark. He was an extraordinarily twisted man, turning many true gifts to evil purpose. His ruthless and fanatical belief in violence marked him for notoriety and for a violent end." That was the New York Times in 1967 on the death of Malcolm X. No one would agree with that now. I just want to encourage people, spend an hour with Charlie Kirk, make up your own mind. Watch him on a podcast, watch him with Gavin Newsom, see what you think for yourself. I didn't agree with a lot of his opinions, but I do think he was a decent and good man, and there's a reason why so many people are mourning him.
Well, thank you. We got an email asking why more media outlets are not playing Charlie Kirk in his own words. And Ta-Nehisi Coates has a piece in Vanity Fair called "Charlie Kirk Redeemed, A Political Class Finds Its Lost Cause." And I will just say, so much of what Charlie Kirk said was so offensive to the LGBT community and people of color. And I think that needs to be said because so many people of color are losing their jobs in the media. And the people who are looking at Charlie Kirk's past and are writing very critical pieces are Black. Ta-Nehisi Coates, Joy Reid, Jamel Bowie at the New York Times, and Karen Attiah lost her job. And I think it's important to say that, Khalil, because a lot of people of color are losing their jobs and do not have a big platform at this time. And the things, I don't even want to read what Charlie Kirk said about people of color because it's so offensive. So I've been noticing that it's Black people who are standing up and saying, this is very offensive. And yet we're not really talking about a lot of what he said because people are afraid.
Well, this is one of the problems with the way that we abstract these principles when it's convenient to do so, and that principle being free speech, as if the burden of speech is equally distributed. It's not an accident, certainly based on historical patterns, that the day that Charlie Kirk was killed, HBCUs had to go in lockdown, at least a dozen of them around the country, as if either the shooter was Black or that Black people collectively were somehow responsible for Charlie Kirk's death. So the targeting of Black people as an expression of the dangerous national security threat that America faces is a very real, consistent pattern of the way that fascism scapegoats and targets people of color, most especially Black and brown people. The immigration scenario in this country is just, it's certainly an echo of the past, but it is a moral abomination on everything that this country purports to stand for as a nation that claims to be a nation of immigrants.
Thank you for reminding me of this. There's so much going on that I forgot to mention this. I'll just read from ABC News. Multiple historically Black colleges and universities are on lockdown after receiving potential threats on Thursday, including Alabama State, Virginia State, Hampton University in Virginia, Southern University in Louisiana, Clark Atlanta University in Georgia. This is a really important piece of the story, Khalil, that deserves more attention.
Absolutely, as if any of those students were in Utah. So like if you were going to look for a likely shooter in the context of a university or college, you would look, there is no HBCU in Utah for obvious reasons, but it doesn't make any sense other than that it is part of the consistent way in which anti-Black racism serves as an organizing principle for how to incentivize or discipline white people. The white people that you want to succeed in this country get to scapegoat Black and brown people as if they're taking something from them. This is the animating feature of the Great Replacement theory. So this is all playing out as it should based on longstanding patterns that we've seen in this country.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Khalil Gibran Muhammad is professor of African American Studies and Public Affairs at Princeton University and author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. Alberto Toscano is adjunct professor at the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, Canada, and author of Late Fascism, Race, Capitalism, and the Politics of Crisis. Alberto and Khalil, thank you for your work and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rose.
Thank you. Thanks to Johanna Miyake for producing today's show. Thanks to Kevin Vance for engineering our show. And thank you so much for joining us. I'm Rose Aguilar. It's your call.